I was asked to chair this session, which is, I guess, the last session of the event, right? We were going to have 4 speakers on the panel, but one of them is marooned in Casablanca, if I understand this correctly from the email correspondence. It sounded a little artificial to me, but he's a scholar of very high integrity, so he literally was not able to make it from Morocco to here because of technical difficulties with one of the planes. So, but that's fine. We will recover from the loss of Professor Pfluger. We have 3 wonderful speakers lined up, and they'll have a little bit more leeway to say what's on their minds. So let me then introduce our 3 speakers in the order in which they will appear. First on the docket will be Angela Stent, who is no stranger to Harvard University. She was a graduate student back in very early, prehistoric times with,
the 19th century.
With me, and she went on to a very distinguished career in academia, but also in government. She's worked in several highly responsible positions in Washington, and she is one of America's, for sure, leading experts on Russian foreign policy in its several dimensions. So she will speak first. Lilia Shevtsova will then take the floor. She's a highly visible and distinguished Russian political scientist and a public intellectual. She's a critic of the government, but she's also a very balanced and professional analyst, and so we're very lucky to have her. She is, again, has had a number of positions over the years, has taught in the West, worked in the West a lot as well as at home, and she's currently, we're happy to say, an associate, a visiting fellow at the Davis Center this semester. So she will speak second. And third will be my colleague Rawi Abdullah, who is Professor of Business Administration here at Harvard, and he is currently the director of the Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies. And Rawi's primary field of expertise is political economy or international political economy. He's written several books on this subject, one of them about the post-Soviet space, which I still use in teaching, a wonderful study, and then several others, a rather broader scope. They were asked, we asked our panelists beforehand what they would like to talk about, and we're not going to hold them to this, but just to cite the emails that were sent. Angela said, I plan to talk about Russia and the EU, Russia and Germany, and Russia's view of the current transatlantic relationship, all in roughly 10 minutes. Well, you're not going to have 15 minutes, so it won't be quite so bad. As for Lilia, she said, I will give my interpretation of the Russian posture on Europe. I guess I will discuss the paradox, how an anti-European system is using Europe for its survival. So that's very provocative. And Rawi said I would be inclined to speak about political economic matters, including the Nord Stream 2 pipeline project. And he also said, I'm happy to pick up slack wherever others leave off. And we'll hold him to that. So let's begin then with Professor Stent.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank the Center for European Studies and the other sponsors of this conference for inviting me to be on this panel so that I could walk through Harvard Yard and think about some moons ago what it was like to begin here as a graduate student. And Rawi, maybe there'll be some slack to take up, but we'll see. I should tell the audience before I start that 3 of us at this table, Tim Colton and Rawi and myself, 3 weeks ago were in Sochi, and we were listening to Vladimir Putin, among others, talk about many of the issues that in fact were discussed today. And so in my remarks, I will be relating some of those ideas that came through. So the focus of this conference is European populism. The panels that I've heard today don't make me too optimistic about a lot of things, and I don't know whether this last panel is going to make you any more optimistic, but hopefully it will enlighten you a little bit more. And so I did think that I would begin by looking at Russia's view of the European Union, how the view from the Kremlin might assess how well or badly Russia has done in terms of its own goals vis-a-vis the European Union, and how this is viewed by Vladimir Putin and his advisors. Secondly, I will spend a few minutes on Germany, since Germany remains the single most important European interlocutor for, albeit a problematic one from the Kremlin's point of view. And then I can't resist talking a little bit about the Russian view of the transatlantic relationship, because that's also really an essential part of the way that the Kremlin views Europe. Now, I want to begin with a few basic propositions about the way that the Kremlin, the people in it, view Europe. And I would say Russia, and before it the Soviet Union, has always been very wary of the European Union. Several times at these conferences that we've attended with Vladimir Putin, he said, echoing Henry Kissinger, maybe he read this or discussed it with him, I don't have a telephone number for Europe. I don't understand how an organization that rotates the presidency, this is a few years ago, can function. So questioning the viability of an organization like the European Union. And I think you have to understand that from the Kremlin's perspective, the difference between absolute sovereignty and limited sovereignty is a key ingredient that informs the way that Putin and those around him see the world. Again, Putin has on several occasions said that there are only really 3 or 4 totally sovereign countries in the world, absolutely sovereign countries, and those are Russia, China, and India. The United States is not, in this view, fully sovereign because we have allies, because we are limited in what we can do by listening to our allies. And for Russia, you know, absolute sovereignty, as we can see through Russian actions also, is a very important principle guiding the foreign policy. And of course, if you believe in absolute sovereignty, you believe that those countries that don't have absolute sovereignty have relative sovereignty or actually limited sovereignty. And that's certainly the way that Putin views the countries in the post-Soviet space. So the sovereignty, I think, is very important. So I think it's quite difficult for people in the Kremlin to understand how countries in Europe could voluntarily relinquish some of their sovereignty and become part of this sort of supranational body. And I think there are a couple of other things, obviously, about the European Union that are problematic for the Kremlin. The whole idea that this is a community of values that represents common values. And we know what Putin has said about that. He has said that this isn't really true, and I think the Russians in general sort of view this as hypocritical of the EU to talk about these common values in which they believe. And I think the other basic point is that Russia has always preferred to deal with European countries on a bilateral level and not as, again, a multilateral unit. So the EU has always been problematic for the Soviet Union and also for Russia. Now, what we heard a couple of weeks ago, not surprisingly, is that the European Union began to appear much more threatening to Russia. Well, first of all, really when it embarked on the Eastern Partnership Program, but particularly when it embarked on its negotiations for an association agreement with Ukraine, with Georgia, with Moldova, and with Armenia. You know, we got a lively explanation about why this was really wrong-headed and why this was threatening to Russia. But this is when the EU, I think, began to be viewed in a much more negative light, whereas before that, NATO had always been the multilateral organization that the Russians had focused on. So what have we seen in the last couple of years? We've obviously seen Kremlin support, and this was touched upon today at lunch as well, for Eurosceptical groups of all varieties. We know that there was some Russian, whether it's money, it's through social media. I mean, it's always very murky to determine what we mean when you talk about Russian support of, but it's often all of the above. In the things leading up to the Brexit vote and since then, certainly we know that there were loans made by Russian banks to Marine Le Pen, to the National Front, and some other of the extreme right-wing Eurosceptical parties. And we suspect, and I think Ana Palacio hinted at that today, that there was some Russian influence behind, you know, the Catalan separatist movement. Again, she was talking about the bots. You can go back to this, again, the murky area of social media and cyber interference. We know that there has also been Russian support for the AfD in Germany and other similar groups. Every year, different Russian organizations, it's not the Kremlin directly, hold conferences of separatists. This is the first time I, as a Russian expert, learned about Texas, the Texas separatist movement, and other ones, even in the United States. And so they also hold different conferences for extreme right-wing groups, and maybe it's sometimes the same conference. Anyway, you've seen, I think, in the different aspects of Russian, which can mean a number of different things, support for these right-wing and left-wing Eurosceptical anti-American groups, of course, that's another part of all of this, through the full array of the purveyance of what we can politely call alternative facts about what is happening in Europe and what the European Union is. Now, it is true Russia did not create Euroscepticism, obviously. This movement arises from what's been happening in different European countries. But I think the Russians have done pretty well at understanding how to exploit and influence these movements, even though clearly they didn't create them. And we've also heard Vladimir Putin at these meetings, really, particularly last year, sort of position himself as a supporter of European and American, by the way, populism. He talks about the way that the Western elites have failed their people, and he portrays himself somehow as on the side of the poor and the dispossessed in these populist movements. And the final part of this, I think, that has an appeal to some of the more right-wing traditional groups in Europe, certainly, and I have to say in the United States, is this portrayal of Russia as a defender of traditional Christian European values, whereas the EU, as we all know, according to this Russian line of arguing, has become decadent, satanic, and has abandoned its Christian roots. So this is another appeal, as I say, not only in Europe, in the United States too. And so I would say, and maybe Lilia will disagree with me, that probably in the last 18 months since the Brexit vote, on that front, things have looked pretty good for the Kremlin in terms just of the questioning of the European Union, the rise of all these movements, and uncertainty about what the future of the EU is. And certainly at these Valdai gatherings, we've increasingly heard, and particularly this year, the sentiment that the European Union really is on its way out. And what's going to replace it, hopefully from the Russian point of view, is a return to kind of a realpolitik Europe of different national states. So let me finally come to, I think, another issue that, again, was very well discussed this morning, and that's the question of the rise of illiberal democracies, particularly in Central and Eastern Europe, in what I guess our former Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld once called the New Europe. Now, what we see in a country like Hungary, again, which we heard a lot about this morning, and then also, to a lesser degree, in Slovakia, in the Czech Republic, in Bulgaria, certainly, are increasingly pro-Russian policies. I mean, this is clearly true of Hungary. The one country, obviously, that is, alas, looks like an illiberal democracy where you don't see that is, of course, Poland, where both the government and, much of the population remain very skeptical of Russia. But along with this illiberal democracy has gone, at least in Central and Eastern Europe, a more favorable views of Russia, and again, much more critical views both of the United States, but also, obviously, of Brussels. So, what hasn't gone so well for the Kremlin is that until now, EU solidarity on the sanctions regime imposed after the annexation of Crimea and the launch of the war in the Donbass, that so far has been maintained. There are individual countries that we know, including Hungary, but also Italy, Greece, and other countries that complain about these sanctions, that say that they should be lifted. But so far, the major countries, Germany, France, and the UK, as long as it's in the European Union, have maintained this sanctions regime. And so it doesn't look as if EU solidarity on this is going to crumble anytime soon. It's just not worth it for the smaller EU countries to push this as a major agenda item in all of the other things that are on their plate in Brussels. Now, let me just say a word about NATO. I mean, obviously, NATO has been, for the Russians, for a long time, really, maybe a few years in the early 90s when it wasn't characterized that way, but the main enemy. And of course, it's become more and more so in the last few years. What the Kremlin seems not to have understood or thought through is the fact that its actions in Ukraine, but also obviously in the Baltic, increasingly both by land, sea, and air, if you like, have induced, have meant that NATO has gotten together and reassessed what it's doing in this part of the world, and it's now, reconsidered whether it was a wise thing to withdraw so much militarily from this part of Europe. And so we now have, for the first time, a German brigade in Lithuania for a very long time. We have other countries, Canada and others, France, I think, who've sent extra troops to the Baltic states, and you have an increase in American troop presence in Poland. So in fact, it's bringing NATO closer to Russia's borders in the very way that Russia complains about, but of course in reaction to what Russia itself has been doing. And it just, again, the one thing that Russia, I think, has succeeded in doing since 2014 is to cause a serious debate within NATO about whether Article 5, the collective self-defense article, is indeed viable when you look at the Baltic states. And it's an argument that hasn't been resolved, I don't think, but in reaction to this, at least, there has been this increase in troop presence there, which is not what Russia initially wanted. All right, let me just turn to Germany for a few minutes. Arguably, from the Kremlin's point of view, certainly the most important European interlocutor in Europe. I believe that Angela Merkel really is at least the Western politician who understands Russia, and particularly Vladimir Putin, better than anyone else. After all, as we know, she grew up in the GDR. She won prizes as a young girl in high school for her Russian language skills. She loves the culture. She knows Russia, and I think she understands really the modus operandi that she has seen from the Kremlin, from the first time when she had the famous meeting with when Connie the Labrador was sent to meet her. Now, Putin was described by one of our German colleagues early on as der Deutsche im Kreml, the German in the Kremlin. But of course, his understanding of Germany is very specific. It's that of a mid-level KGB officer who was living in Dresden from 1985 to 1990. So, as I say, it's a rather peculiar understanding of that. Now, what's happened, of course, is that since the annexation of Crimea, 3 minutes.
I think so.
Take my 5 minutes.
No. All right.
Take 5 or 6 minutes.
All right, 5 or 6 minutes, okay. That since the annexation of Crimea, clearly the relationship has moved from, as one of our colleagues called it, Ostpolitik to Frostpolitik, which I think is a great way of describing it. In the many conversations that she's had with Vladimir Putin about Ukraine, where he has presented alternative facts, this hasn't helped it. And even though the German population itself remains divided about Russia, there's serious divisions. The AfD and the Left Party, of course, are very pro-Russian. The SPD has been trying to improve ties to Russia. We had actually President Steinmeier there just 2 weeks ago. But so far, as long as she's chancellor, and she will be now for the next few years, she has held the line there. I just think it'll be very interesting to see what happens in the coalition negotiations as they now stand. If the Greens were to, in fact, get the foreign ministry, the Greens are the one political party in Germany that really still focus on the human rights situation in Russia. But presumably, even if they do, the chancellery will keep, as it has for the last however long she's, since 2005 at least, will keep within itself the direction of Russia policy. All right, so let me finally just turn very briefly to the transatlantic relationship. So from the Russian point of view, from the Kremlin's point of view, the election of Donald Trump has had a number of effects, not all of which they disapprove of. And that is to say, we now have the United States as, really the major figure in the world of instability and unpredictability. And from the Kremlin's point of view, this has some value to it. Certainly, you have a president in the White House who has downplayed the significance of our traditional alliances, who doesn't seem to be very interested in Europe, who obviously has had a very awkward relationship so far with Angela Merkel, and who, of course, has consistently praised Vladimir Putin, be it during the campaign or since he's been in the White House. And so that all looks quite good. Fissures between the US and Europe, a US that would like to, make deals with Russia, but I don't have to tell you, even if you don't live in this country, that the domestic Russia investigations here have really put a clamp on the White House's ability to pursue this forward-looking agenda with Russia. And as far as I'm concerned, as long as these investigations continue, this will be the case. And one more point, and then I will turn it over to Lydia. Congress has introduced some very tough sanctions legislation. I think that's quite problematic. In order to prevent the president from unilaterally lifting the sanctions on Russia. But one of the side effects of this legislation, and maybe Rawi will be talking more about that, is it could have serious detrimental effects on U.S.-European relations in terms of Europe's business ties with Russia and also future energy deals. And that could cause fissures that might, in the end, lead the EU to reconsider the sanctions. And this is a concern that I have, and I'll be interested in Rawi's view of it. And I will finish with a statement that we did hear 2 weeks ago from a senior Russian official, and he said, "We only look like Europeans, but we really are different."
Well, just like European. Well, that's a treat to be here, and it's such a great pleasure to be at the same panel with friends. It's always pleasant. And Angela, you in fact shortened my narrative here because, well, you painted the landscape, and now what I have to do, I will try to add a couple of brush strokes here and there, well, maybe black and white and a bit of red, making the picture much more impressionistic Renoir style. So, in fact, I have 3 points to deliver. The first point about Kremlin-European bargain. Well, you're absolutely right saying that Europe, especially United Europe, and especially Brussels, has always been problematic for Moscow, for the Kremlin. Because Putin and all other political leaders in Russia looked at Brussels just like Kissinger and Brzezinski, seeing in Brussels a kind of retirement house, and trying to replace Brussels, first of all, with Berlin, of course, Paris, and to some extent London. But today, viewing the whole landscape on the international scene, and after some, I would say, frustration with the Moscow shift pivot towards China, Moscow has started to think much more seriously about Europe, not about Brussels, but Europe, believing that Europe really is a kind of vehicle, an engine for Russian economic growth, and Europe is much more important for Russian system survival than the United States of America. Hence, there is a kind of effort on the psychological, political, geopolitical scene to create a much more coherent understanding of Europe and policy towards Europe, within the Kremlin. And I would say there are kind of 2 aspects which look like kind of cognitive dissonance, but still they do exist. On the one hand, Moscow suggests to return back, not to Yalta. Nobody's speaking about Yalta in Russia anymore. Yalta, it's kind of old, marginal notion, but everybody returns much more further into the history, into the 19th century, to the Westphalian system, to the concept of nation, trying to update it and to return it into the current new reality. A concept of nations means what? Means borders, sovereignty, areas of interest. But this doesn't mean that Moscow, in such a primitive way, looks at the current scenery of the 21st century. Kremlin tries to combine this Westphalian leftovers or concept of nation idea with what? With what Zygmunt Bauman called liquid modernity, with postmodernity, which means watering down major principles and norms and watering down distinction between sovereignty and dependence, between fair and unfair, truth and lie, etc. So it's very much Putin-esque, first of all, Westphalian picture and postmodernity. In fact, which means that the Kremlin is trying to find how to insert tradition into the context of globalization. Well, a second point, what is the essence of the Kremlin's new manifesto? What is the current stage of development of this kind of Putinesque idea? Well, I would like to remind that in 2004, 2007, the Kremlin, in fact, made a shift from the normative dimension and stopped even declaring that Russia is ready, yes, you're right, ready to be integrated into Europe. Russia stopped even mimicking, imitating the European political institutions, believing that there is a kind of axiom that Europe will stomach Russian non-Western, non-European standards and remain within the institutional, organizational structure of Europe. In 2012, 2015, we see the attempt of reckless, assertive attack on the international order, on the existing liberal order, and Crimea annexation is just a demonstration. Well, not anymore. In 2016, we see the attempts to start a new stage, start a new development in policy of, in search of the new European policy in the Kremlin. And what is the essence of this policy, as far as I feel it? Well, you know, very often people sitting in Moscow could feel in a different way. So we feel that the Kremlin is trying to prevent further confrontation with the West. The Kremlin is trying to find any way to to exit from the sanction regime. The Kremlin doesn't want even, you know, to increase the role of the previous coercive diplomacy. Well, it's a kind of looking for a new post-containment order. So this kind of search started in 2016 when the Kremlin understood that the decisive attack on Ukraine has failed, sanction regime, and something should be done, especially after Europeans have been so stubborn reproducing the sanction regime, and after the Kremlin understood that Trojan horses, Hungary, Austria, Trojan horses within the Social Democratic Party of Germany, French, they do not help to break the unity, European unity on the sanctions. So what are the elements of the new agenda? I will briefly give you the list of possible Russian demands. Well, firstly, Europe has to accept the Kremlin's explanation of the origins of the crisis and to admit that Russia really has been humiliated by NATO enlargement, by EU enlargement. So please accept our explanation of what has happened. Secondly, Europe has to recognize the principle, yes, of equality, which means, in the Russian understanding, which presupposes multipolarity, especially in the situation when US is retrenching. Multipolarity means, you know, that Russia and China should be centers of new gravity, okay? And of course, multipolarity and equality means that security has to be broader. It should not be concentrated around NATO security, but would include Russia. Thirdly, Europeans should stop talking finally about the reform of the Security Council and rejection of the veto right. Security Council has to be reproduced in the old form. Fourthly, next pillar of the Russian external vision is definitely, Angela is right, sovereignty. Sovereignty understood as absence of any kind of interference, dusting all these Helsinki Accords, etc. But at the same time, Russia's readiness to have areas of interest outside of Russia, so limited sovereignty of other countries, especially of neighboring countries, but not only neighboring countries, Middle East too. Fifthly, the Kremlin suggests its vision of common neighborhood, which means that all neighboring countries could be common space for Russia and possibly for the West. I wonder what other countries will be thinking about that. Six, one more premise. Europe should recognize Crimea as part of Russia and rescind visa ban against Crimean residents. And finally, this is already from Ravis Bosket, energy partnership should not be threatened by energy diversification in Europe. So we also could add to that a discussion, lively discussion, that of course our colleagues that were present at Valdai meeting were able to participate or to argue with Russians. Russians are playing with several, I would say, updated all traditional ideas. Russia as the center or pillar of big Eurasia. Not normal Eurasia, but big Eurasia. And big Eurasia, of course, should include not only Siberia, Russia, well, of course, Central Asia, Ukraine, etc., but Europe too. This is a big Eurasia, okay? And big Eurasia should be a kind of bridge towards China, okay? Integration of integrations, which mean quite the idea produced, as far as I know, not in Moscow, but in Berlin, and within the Social Democratic Party. And it was Steinmeier who, by the way, exclaimed at some point that this is such a novelty, maybe this will be the grand design of the 21st century, which means that integration between the Eurasian Union and European Union, well, quite exotic. So what we see an attempt to reproduce the notion of the traditional great power, but updated within the new geopolitical context. And the idea to preserve globalization as open borders, but globalization that could be useful for the Russian political class. Well, and it seems to me there are really, Angela, I would agree, there is a kind of, still some kind of optimism regarding the so-called Kremlin tactical brilliance. I don't see any kind of tactical brilliance. I see sometimes tactical successes as a result of the Western weaknesses that bear apparently strategic disasters. But, the Kremlin definitely is looking at the US retrenching, okay? As you mentioned, a collapse or crisis of transatlantic partnership, looks at Brexit with euphoria, okay? And this national populism that subsides, but still there is a kind of hope that this is the time for us, guys. This is the void. This is the post. We should use it. And the updated Russian foreign policy agenda, it's wonderful. There is nothing about humiliation of Russia. I don't know. I'm reading your Washington think tank reports, and the major key slogan over there is insecurity. Insecurity of Russia, vulnerability is the premise of the Russian foreign policy. Apparently, the guys are not reading the updated foreign policy concept, because the biggest idea, the premise, the key assumption of the Russian foreign policy is not vulnerability, is the fact that the West is over. The West is in degradation and decay, and this is our time. True. I just don't know how the guys in the Kremlin solve the problem of cognitive dissonance, because, well, in fact, humiliation because of NATO and EU expansion cannot fit into the context of the Russian foreign policy concept. Anyway, but this is, the usual cognitive dissonances, the disease of the Kremlin corridors. And the third point, what does this vision gives us to think about? Is it coherent or not? I would leave my friends at this panel to give an answer to what extent the Western Europeans will accept the notion of the new concept of nation in the 21st century. To what extent Europe could accept the common space instead of Finlandization. To what extent there will be, it will be acceptable for the West. It seems to me it's acceptable to some circles in Berlin to talk about integration of integrations, or, for instance, about big Eurasia as the bridge between Europe and China. But for me, two questions here are important, and maybe I should try to respond to them. Yes, 1 minute. Firstly, what does the Russian elite thinking about this kind of, updated concept from the Kremlin? I would say, yes, a Russian political elite, especially these people who made outflow from Russia that amounts $700 billion during the last decade. Of course they would like to have more or less normal relations within the Western community as a result of their personal integration. And at the same time, they would love to have behind their back some kind of, shadow of great power. But they're so unhappy. They're so frustrated now because what's happening now, with all this restiveness, aggressiveness, Crimea annexation, war with Ukraine and Syria, it makes their life miserable within the European and Western community. Yes, your sanctions, Section 241 of the Congress Sanction Act, will be known, you know, the repercussions on February 2, and this is disaster. Moscow is just, you know, already sitting on pills. And besides, you know, when Brits in London finally got the courage to convene the conference, deciding what should they do with approximately 29 anonymous owners of great estate in London and London counties, that's also the sign for the Russian co-optated elite that something is going wrong. So Russian elite is unhappy. Russian elite does not want muscular, coercive diplomacy. But at the moment they do not rebellion, they are waiting for some moments maybe to come to express their disapproval. But so far, hardly this kind of grand vision will have a support within the Russian political elite. What about the population? Well, when we look at the TV programs, when we talk to Russians, well, often, very often, you'll hear anti-European, anti-American sentiment. What are the real numbers? The real numbers are now, in 2017, 38% of respondents view the EU positively, 48% negatively. In 2004, 76% of Russians viewed the EU positively, 13% negatively. Well, now only, I would say, now only 23% of Russian respondents would like Russia to join the EU, 62% against. But at the same time, one shouldn't exaggerate anti-European sentiment and anti-Western sentiment within the Russian society. 57% of Russians believe that great power and foreign policy means we have to have benevolent, effective for the economic development external environment. So they're not in favor of confrontation. Only 14% of Russians would like to have expansion and confrontation with the West. And moreover, now Russians, even supporting Crimea annexation, would not like to pay with their salaries and pensions for the Crimea occupation and war in Syria and in Ukraine. So the final sentence, what do we have? What is the goal of the Kremlin's policy? As just Angela has pointed out, and definitely Ravi will be talking about it, the Russian political elite, and especially the current ruling group in the Kremlin, would like, would dream, would want to have Europe as the leading key mechanism of survival of the Russian system. And Europe has been this mechanism of survival for decades, especially after 17, when in fact Germany succeeded, your favorite Germany, my favorite Germany, succeeded to prolong the life of the Soviet Union, maybe for several decades, with its Ostpolitik and with bargain, oil instead of pipelines and money. Well, the problem is that I am not so sure that the Russian leaders and Russian political establishment understands the problem of Merkel, which is much more formidable, and even more. Just recently, last week, I didn't write it. It was Macron's speech. Well, I read it in Spiegel. It's absolutely flabbergasting for French, who after de Gaulle could have been hardly called the political elite. You know, Macron has this absolutely wonderful, courageous European grand mission. I don't know whether Merkel will support him or not, but definitely Kremlin underestimates this two tango on the European scene. Two questions remain to be important. Well, of course, nothing will happen productive in the Russian foreign policy towards Europe during the Putin's tenure. Simply, he is in a kind of situation when he cannot backtrack, he cannot change. The problem is whether he will address much more assertive policy towards Europe, trying weak European leadership in the capitals when there is weak European leadership to accept Russia's rules of the game. And more important question is whether the post-Putin's Russia will be ready to change trajectory, to return back to the idea of integration. I would bet that there are grounds to be positive about that. but in what direction Russia will be moving and in what direction Europe will be moving will decide one country that is crucial from geopolitical point of view and from civilization point of view. And you know the name of this country, Ukraine.
Well, very good, thank you. It's a thankless job to be sitting here trying to get somebody who's saying very wise things to just bring it to a conclusion. And there may be a little bit of a Russian rhetorical style here that I've noticed over the years, which is somehow the way that things are packaged and with numbering schemes and so forth, which makes it almost impossible to be so rude as to interrupt. So I didn't mean to be rude, but it is time to move on to our next and final speaker, Ravi Abdullah, please.
Thanks, Tim, and it's a great thrill to be on the same panel with Angela and Lilia. And it's interesting moment in American history in which one does not even have to have an email cache at the Democratic National Committee to be hacked to have one's emails made public. So thanks for that, Tim. There is, in fact, indeed, there's not any slack to pick up. It was just a kind offer on my part. Please accept my apologies. I have not been here with you today. I've been across the river teaching executives at Harvard Business School about a country with a fragile regime and a difficult history that is struggling to diversify its export profile away from oil and gas. That country is Nigeria, in fact. But moving to the part of Eurasia that is more like Nigeria with snow, onto Russia. I wanted to frame my remarks on a different kind of set of relations, which represent an overlapping set of relations. And so if Angela and Lilia were talking more about government-to-government relations or European Commission to government relations in this Russian-European relationship, one of the interesting characteristics of this relationship over many decades, now almost 5 decades, is that as with the rest of the international system, government-to-government relations is one part of how the system functions, but there is another overlapping set of relations, and those relations are between and among firms, and particularly multinational firms. And that set of relations has had a different logic from time to time from the government-to-government relations. And this set of relations among firms, among Russian firms and European firms, which now goes back many decades, is especially true in the field of energy, but it is not just in the field of energy. In fact, these relations are very deep and very intimate. In energy, they are the most intimate set of relations among firms. And the dependence that has been built up on both sides over these decades is truly profound. And so I would start by observing, and I'm sorry if this has already come up in your conversations today, but the common refrain that Europe, broadly speaking, depends on Russian energy is, of course, obviously true. One can look at those statistics to discover the ways in which different European nations have energy systems that are dependent on the import of Russian gas. And those moments of dependence vary quite a bit across European nations. France a little bit less because it has nuclear power, Germany more, some nations in Central Europe and in the Baltics really profoundly much. But just observing Europe's dependence on Russia is wholly insufficient for understanding this overall pattern of relations. And indeed, to Lilia's really brilliant observation about the way in which Europe is central in some fundamental ways to the sustainability of the Russian regime, one might look to one particular agent in this set of relations, and that is Gazprom, the Russian gas monopoly. The Gazprom is 50% plus 1 share owned by the Russian state, which by Russian corporate governance standards, of course, gives the state total control over Gazprom. But more generally, when we think about the role that Gazprom plays in this set of overlapping relations, it's clear how dependent and very deeply dependent the Russian regime is on its relations with Europe, and particularly these firm-to-firm relations. So Gazprom, if one looks at its business model, at its income statement in particular, one can see that Gazprom is completely dependent on European markets for its profitability. Gazprom sells more or less 1/3 of its gas by volume inside Europe to European firms, not, of course, yet directly to European customers, but to European firms. That 1/3 of its gas by volume earns Gazprom 2/3 of its revenues. Gazprom then sells 2/3 of its gas by volume inside Russia and other parts of the former Soviet Union. And that 2/3 by volume earns Gazprom only 1/3 of its revenues. Which is to say, Gazprom would not be a profitable entity at all if it only sold gas inside Russia or in the former Soviet Union. It is only a profitable entity at all because it sells gas to Europe. If we look at the moments in which Gazprom's taxes and dividends paid to the Russian state sometimes exceed 15 or 20% of the Russian federal budget, and then ask the question, who is dependent upon whom, it is clear that both are dependent on each other, and very, very deeply so, with different rhythms of the challenge of that dependence. But if we look at the sustainability of the regime today in Russia, one might say that Russia's dependence on European markets is the foundation of the stability of the Russian state itself. So indeed, mutual dependence is the story here. And on this relationship among Gazprom, but not just Gazprom, Rosneft and other Russian energy firms and a handful of European energy firms, particularly German and French and Italian firms, though not just, also Austrian and Dutch and several others, these relationships go back many decades. They were built, in fact, before Gazprom was Gazprom, when it was the Soviet Ministry of Gas. And these original deals struck in the 1960s and 1970s that brought Soviet gas to Western Europe not only helped to save the Soviet state through these export earnings, but also provided essential energy imports for a rapidly growing Europe. And the United States was, when those original deals were struck, very much against them. There was another attempt to undermine the flourishing of these firm-to-firm relations during the 1980s with the Reagan regime. The theory was, of course, that over time, the mutual dependence of then the Soviet Union and later Russian firms would bring Russia and Europe closer together and fragment the transatlantic alliance, which turns out to have been exactly true in terms of how things unfolded. So these long-standing firm-to-firm ties that go back to the 1960s and 70s, which persist today, relationships actually of deep trust among the executives, trust built up over decades of some very difficult geopolitical moments, and yet the gas still flowed. Even through the chaos of the 1990s, through the transition from the unconventional gas revolution to a new process of setting prices for piped gas, through the Ukrainian gas crises of 2006 and 2009, through the annexation of Crimea, through the emergence of the sanctions regime, and even beyond the challenges of subsidiarity in Brussels, through the challenge of the Polish competition authorities' attempts to undermine the development of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. So all of this, surviving these many geopolitical challenges, geopolitical challenges that started in the middle of the Cold War and have gone through several decades of crisis after crisis, and still these firm-to-firm relations have remained intact. One of the interesting challenges, which both Angela and Lilia brought up, is whether there might be a way for US policy finally, after 5 decades, to undermine these firm-to-firm relationships with the way in which the new sanctions legislation has been written, in which the sanctions regime of the United States would apply extraterritorially, even to European energy firms that do any business in Russia. This is still left to the discretion of the President of the United States, But the mere uncertainty of the possibility of that kind of sanctions regime being put in place makes it incredibly difficult for a project like Nord Stream 2, which costs tens of billions of euro and years to create. That kind of uncertainty is, of course, not good for business. So the fraying of public ties has created the possibility of this moment of finally potentially undermining these robust private ties, these firm-to-firm ties. But I doubt it, and even if that were to come to pass, I think it would be quite catastrophic for the future of the European-Russian relationship and indeed for the transatlantic relationship. From my understanding of the time, at least that I've spent in Europe, not just with the energy firms, but with public officials, European executives and public officials seem to me to be absolutely infuriated by the idea of the extraterritorial imposition of US sanctions against European energy firms, not just in the context of Nord Stream 2, but also in the many other dimensions in which these firm-to-firm relationships are deeply robust. And so I think rather than the undermining of these ties, I think this is a moment in which the US-European relationship is likely to be even more challenged by the really genuinely domestic political considerations that have led to the new sanctions regime, but in a way that European leaders, I think, will be absolutely unwilling to accept. Now, I'm not sure exactly what that will mean in terms of the US-European negotiation over the meaning of the new sanctions regime, but the idea that on a whim, the US Congress might write a piece of legislation with no hearings in order to constrain the President of the United States could actually create a system in which European firms can't go about their business seems to me basically inconceivable. And then I would just conclude by observing that the fact of these overlapping systems, one of government to government and the other of firms to firms, it is in fact incredibly valuable to have continued to have these ties that persist from firms to firms, even in these moments of geopolitical tension. They are ways of connecting these societies in the assumption that Europe and Russia will continue to have to live together because nobody's geography is going to be changing anytime soon, and that these economies are likely to continue to need one another in some very deep ways. We should certainly, I think, lament the idea that we might finally rupture these firm-to-firm ties, as inconvenient as they might be for some other political ends. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Okay, terrific. So, since we're having this discussion on the eve of the centenary of the Russian Revolution, which changed a lot of things, it's impossible not to think about the potential for change. You referred to disruption, Rawi, and I think both Lilia and Angela were also referring to a situation that seems both stuck and also somehow rather fragile, and where the categories, in this case spatial categories and cultural categories, are also open to debate in ways that are at times somewhat surprising. So when Lilia referred to this big change in 2016, I suspect a lot, in Russian thinking, I suspect a lot of people in this room were hearing this for the first time. This is not widely reported in our media. So anybody who studies Europe is used to the, and I don't put myself in that category, to the endless conversation about what Europe is, right, and what it means and all of that. Europe is not the EU, not the same as the EU. Geographically speaking, spatially speaking, 40% of Europe is Russia. 20% of the population of Europe is Russia. So one is inside the other, kind of, and also an extension of the other. So these are categories that are readily contestable politically, that are have a shape-shifting form to them at certain times. The same applies to Eurasia. God knows, Lilia would know that better than us. What exactly does it mean?
No, I don't know what it means.
Yeah, we were having this conversation over lunch not long ago. And even this phrase now, Greater Eurasia, is clearly used in different contexts in very different ways. So the Chinese now speak of a Greater Eurasia from Shanghai to St. Petersburg. So that actually excludes the EU. But some Russians seem to be talking about Greater Eurasia that would include Europe as well as Asia. Also, some of the proponents of these various integration schemes within Russia, and this will bring a smile to your lips because you know the individuals, so they're Eurasian integrationists now, but 10 years ago they were actually European integrationists.
Yes.
The same
Exactly.
people. We want to integrate and find some way of changing the boundaries to create this larger entity. And it used to be Europe, forget Europe. Now it's going to be Eurasia. But you know, in a way, Lily brought us back to earth by pointing out that Europe is in terms of Russian thinking, not by any means a declining category or one that they feel they can afford to ignore. And I sense this in my conversations with members of the Russian elite, that there's some anxiety, I think, about the entente with China being exaggerated and not really in Russia's best interests. I think a lot of the people who run Russian economic policy, this economic bloc, are very skeptical about this turn in that direction. The population polls show actually does take a steadily warmer attitude towards China. This is true, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they know what their government is doing in terms of, you know, potentially abandoning Europe. Also, in terms of, just one final comment, in terms of stability, it is intriguing to see how, if things are falling apart in Russia right now, or if there's pressure for change, it really does seem to be, for the moment, mostly at the elite level. At the mass level, in a way, the government has handled the sanctions thing quite brilliantly, and there's very clear polling evidence from independent survey teams to show that the number of Russians who feel that sanctions are hurting them has gone way down since 2015. So the high point in terms of anxiety about the material effect of sanctions on their lives was already 2 or 3 years ago. And support for the government's policy vis-a-vis Ukraine in terms of sticking with the status quo has not been shaken one whit by the sanctions. So, but at the elite level, I think there are doubts. Doubts are mounting. There are all these economics, you know, storm flags, banks going bankrupt, and you know, there's a lot of concern at that level. So, just to stop, it is maybe at some point the panel can reflect on the potential for change here. Maybe. Change that would be healthy for all concerned and change that would not necessarily be healthy. But before we get to that, I think we should just open up the floor to questions. And so the system, I think, that's worked out here is that questions or comments would be people just approach the microphone here, and we'll just take those questions in order. Please be brief. No speeches, just brief comments or questions.
Well, I'll start off with a very short question, and that is on, well, first of all, let me just backtrack and say the input from all of you has been fantastic, and thank you. On the question of the survey of the, oh,
Yeah.
thank you.
Should we identify ourselves? Is that what you're doing today?
Okay,
Please say
yes,
a word. Yeah.
Bob Rosenberg, and involved in both business and policy issues. So the question on the survey is, are those responses that are given what people in Russia feel they need to give because of the new conditions within Russia? Or is this based on indirect questions which could elicit what the true feelings are?
Okay. So this is a kind of methodological question about surveys, is that right?
Not so much methodological, but what is really the underlying beliefs of the Russian people.
All right. Lilia, do you want to say a word?
Okay, if I may, then very good question. That's the question that is being debated in Russia constantly. So when we are talking about reliable pollsters, for instance, Levada sent, okay? So everybody agrees that apparently 68% skyrocketing approval rating of Putin. This is the result of what people are really telling these pollsters. Well, but at the same time, among them, 30% of the people are telling the pollsters that usually during the polls, people do not tell truth. There are other indirect questions. For instance, 68% support Putin. Presidents approve, etc., etc. And at the same time, 75% say that the government and local governments are totally corrupted. But all people do understand that the government is Putin's government. Then 48% of Russians are saying that the interests of the state and individual are different. And more than 40% say that individual should fight the state when their interests are not compatible. So you see there is a cognitive dissonance, but at the same time, people do tell truth when they're asked about their own problems.
Can I just ask?
Yes, of course.
I mean, I've talked to the Levada people who, you know, obviously the most reputable ones, and some of those people say they don't really know whether they believe their own surveys, because obviously I think what you're also hinting at, you know, if you're at home, maybe you're of a certain demographic at home, the phone rings and they ask you these questions, you know, you make choices. So I think, and I think they're the most reliable, but you're quite right, it depends how you ask the question. I'm just going to add one personal anecdote to what Tim was saying. So in May, I did this radio program, Echo of Moscow. That's the one independent radio station that still exists in Russia. Now, admittedly, it's a self-selected audience, right, and it's in the afternoon. But my host, Alexei Venediktov, asked the question, who's a more reliable ally for Russia, the United States or China? And at that poll, at least 25% said China and 75% the United States, whatever that means.
Would you care to comment or no? All right, please, Mary.
Hi, my name is Mary Serrati. I'm a historian, and I'm currently writing a history of the reasons the U.S. decided to expand NATO in the post-Cold War world. So I found many of your comments very fascinating. I had one specific question for Rawi, and then I had one general question for the entire panel, including Tim. The specific question, I thought it was very striking what you said, the importance of these relationships of trust, firm to firm, executive to executive. Through all these crises, the oil kept flowing. Apologies if I missed this, but would you mind naming some of those firms or executives? Because that seems to me to be a very important point, and I would just like to know more about that. And then the broader question, until Tim at the end mentioned the Russian Revolution, I don't think it came up at all, which to me as a historian was very striking, because in my little historian neck of the woods, it's currently all Russian Revolution all the time. There are tons of books coming out, House of Government by Yuri Slezkin and Serhiy Plohi's books, and more Russian Revolution history books you can shake a stick at. So I was really struck by the fact that it didn't come up here as a theme until Tim mentioned it at the very end. And so my question for the entire panel is, does the anniversary weigh on politicians and policymakers? Is there some way that this anniversary comes to light, whether in an implicit or an explicit fashion, in the issues that you've been discussing about? If not, if no one in Russia is talking about it, that would be interesting to me. Or if people in Russia are talking about it, how are they referring to it, since it's obviously a problematic past?
Okay, very good. So maybe we should just let the three members of the panel address any piece of this if they like. Let's start with the very specific question about the firms.
Yeah, so thanks, Mary. Good to see you, by the way. So the firms' names have changed recently. The firms themselves haven't, but the historical relationships, two German firms, Wintershall and Eon, two French firms, GDF Suez, which has now been now has a new name. Eon also has a new name, Uniper. EDF, and the Italian firm ENI, and the Dutch firm Gasunie. I would say among the executives of those firms, the erstwhile CEO of Eon, Klaus Schäfer, is one of the more vocal narrators of these long-standing relationships. I've written some Harvard Business School case studies on elements of these relationships and interviewed many of these executives, and so I can certainly send those to you, and you can see like the full list of people who narrate things in this way. And I would say that the other way to think about it is look at the consortium that built Nord Stream, look at the consortium that was on the verge of building South Stream, and the consortium that is behind Nord Stream 2. And these are the firm-to-firm relationships that have historically been the most robust. And if we think about the key moments of challenge for these relationships, they were the Ukrainian gas crises of 2006 and 2009. And if we think about, from that perspective, how the firms reacted to these gas crises, this was at a moment when more or less 90% of Gazprom's gas exports to European customers transited Ukraine. And so when one looked at those crises, when the gas stopped flowing, the European firms didn't get gas that they could either use to generate heat or generate electricity. And so from the perspective of Europe, but these particular firms have in mind especially, there was a moment of choice. How should we interpret the Ukrainian gas crises? Should we interpret these as crises of Russian reliability of delivering gas? If you look at the mass public opinion in France, Germany, and Italy in particular, it was somewhere between 70 and 80% of the mass public said these were crises of Russian reliability. And this was the overall narrative in Washington, D.C. and in the Western media, that it's obvious that Gazprom is an unreliable supplier of gas. But those were not the opinions that mattered. And if you think about the alternate interpretation, that maybe it's just some complicated relationship between Russia and Ukraine, and it's not that either of them is unreliable. It's not that Gazprom is an unreliable supplier of gas, or that Ukraine is an unreliable supplier of transit. It's just some mess in their relationship, and we should just leave them both alone, in which case you might have expected a different kind of response, which is to diversify away from Russian gas and away from Ukrainian transit. In fact, the actual response that we got from these European firms was first the creation of Nord Stream, and then second, the proposed creation of Nord Stream 2, which does not diversify away from Russian gas. It diversifies away from Ukrainian transit. And the narrative from within those firms, the public narrative, but also the narrative within those firms, is the problem here is Ukrainian transit, not Russian gas and not Gazprom. We've been in business with Gazprom since the 1960s. They're difficult, it's tough to negotiate with them, but we get them, and we know how dependent they are on us, and so we trust that they're trying to get the gas to us, and so we just don't trust the Ukrainian transit anymore. Now, this is not my narrative, to be clear, but this is the evident logic of the actual firm's decisions, since they invested billions of euros in the disintermediation of Ukraine, but it's also how they narrate it in public if you ask them.
Okay, thanks. Now, what about the Russian Revolution? What would you say in response to Mary's?
Well, I'll start, and then you
point?
must
Yeah.
have much more to say about it. I have to remind Ravi of one thing. You're quite right about, the U.S. periodically tries to do this to prevent Europeans from constructing pipelines. Now, of course, in 1963, the Kennedy administration tried to prevent the construction of the Druzhba pipeline, but the oil pipeline. But the difference there was that, and put pressure on Mannesmann, the German company. At that point, West Germany was sufficiently dependent on the United States. They went along with that, although the other providers didn't. So a lot's changed since then. We never seem to learn lessons. I'm just going to say a couple of words about the Russian Revolution. You can say much more about this.
No, not more.
No. I mean, it was clear. Putin himself, by the way, again, a couple of weeks ago, said that it had, there were positive and negative consequences of it. I would say from the point of view of the people in the Kremlin, the problem with the Bolshevik Revolution is it's sort of the mother of all color revolutions, right? You have people going out in the streets protesting against a corrupt government that had lost touch, or the monarchy in this case, with the people, and we know what happened with that. So it's difficult. The most interesting panel we had, Mary, was in fact on the Russian Revolution at this conference. And the four speakers were all in some measure of Russian heritage. One of them was Slutskin, who obviously lives in the United States, Dominic Levin, who comes from a family of Livonian knights, who lives in Great Britain, and then two very good Russian historians, one of them Alexei Miller, who's at the European University in St. Petersburg. And what was fascinating is, they talked about all the different aspects of it, and then they just talked about how their own families, their ancestors, had been involved in this. And so you have two of the panelists who had family who'd been in the white, fought for the whites, had been generals for the whites, had been commanders. You have others whose relatives are, in one case, half of the family were whites and the other were communists, but other people whose families had been peasants, had been workers. And so when you get into discussions like that, you have Russians of all, from different groups and different ethnicities, I would say, discussing the whole panoply and the complexity of all of this. And that discussion had a richness to it, which all the discussions about, greater Eurasia or the global order don't. So this is the real thing, but I would just say that they're still coming to terms with it, which is why, I guess we'll have to see tomorrow, right, what the communists do, because it's November the 7th.
Yeah, right. So let's ask Lily to comment at length, but just on the question of how to categorize the Russian Revolution, the one, so I think Putin is avoided using the phrase color revolution, right?
Right, no, that's my phrase. No, that's my, he didn't
But it
say
actually
that.
is part of definitely part of the discourse about it.
Yeah.
What I remember from the spring was somebody, and it might have been Topornin from MGIMO, who's an official figure, obviously, the Foreign Ministry's University, saying the February Revolution was a color revolution.
Oh, that's right.
And that is, it was a sort of mindless outpouring of energy from below, which destabilized a regime, and then led to a totalitarian takeover, actually said. So that comes later. And anyway, Putin is tiptoed around this. You can see, he's not a revolutionary, God bless him. And yet it's what made the Soviet Union, which was the superpower and all of that. So he, like a lot of us, I think he tends to avoid topics that are painful for him to discuss because he can't figure out what his position is.
Absolutely.
So what will our Russian panelists add to this?
Well, very briefly, to tell you the truth, I'm fighting the whole day trying to write a very short comment about the Russian Revolution for Latin American media, and I couldn't finish it because I can't do it. So I would support both of you. Firstly, there is intentionally no Russian official position on the anniversary and October Revolution. And it's ironical because the legitimacy of the Russian system and leadership is based on returning to the past, but not revolutionary past, to the past of the World War II and Stalin, and intentionally forgetting about Lenin and revolution, both October, February, in order not to frustrate the people. So the dream of the Kremlin is to forget about this anniversary as soon as possible, in order not to antagonize the communists, and in order not to provoke unpleasant and unhealthy, toxic ideas within the population.
Yeah, there's a wonderful article by Maxime Trudolyubov, who's a very gifted Russian journalist who's currently in the United States, on Russia's lost birth certificate, I think. And it appeared in a Kennan Institute publication a couple of weeks ago, and then in the Moscow Times in English. You can find it very easily, where he talks about this. And I remember when I was in Moscow last month, seeing various references to historical antecedents is very much in the air nowadays. And Russian departments and ministries are now very much into explaining where they came from and how exactly when they were founded. So the tax service was created under Peter the Great or something like that, and something else was created in 1850. But I noticed, and I think Max said this as well, that the guard service, the Presidential Guard Service, the FSO, I guess would be right, which guards the official building. So I was staying for a few days in Moscow in a compound, a sealed compound, which is controlled by the presidential administration. Raoul stayed there too, or so is Angela. And they had a calendar, one of these, our roots go back to calendar, Stolyat on 100 years. And so the Presidential Guard Service, never mind this Peter the Great nonsense, we're proud our origins go back to 1917.
Well, they made a mistake.
All right, so we have time for a few more questions, and please go ahead, sir.
Thanks. Jed Schwartz again, Somerville. So the question has to do with whether any of you think that the Russian government could possibly be induced to shift their energy reliance from gas and oil to renewable sources of energy. I mean, I know that's. This is a problem that I've been working on. I mean, trying to figure out an inducement, a workable plan.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. Ravi, you're our energy man.
I'm sorry.
That's yours.
I'm sorry. Before you head off, do you mean Russia's own?
Energy behavior.
Well, I mean,
It's-
they're now. You said, I mean, you said that the government is dependent on Gazprom for
Okay.
an enormous percentage of its revenue and its foreign exchange.
Got it. Okay,
Okay.
yeah.
So how do they? If they're going to shift, there has to be some way to make it work.
Yeah, I'm with
Okay,
you.
we got it. Thank you.
I'm with you. I was wondering whether you meant like the generation of heat and electricity in Russia, which is not what you mean.
That would be
Okay. Yeah. So this is a long-standing dream of every resource-rich nation in the world. So it's not just a Russian problem. It's a Nigerian problem. It's a Norwegian problem. It's a Saudi problem. Nobody so far has figured it out. And if we were to place bets on which country would be the first to figure out how to diversify away from its resource curse, my bet would not be that Russia would get it right before somebody else does. But the Russian regime clearly recognizes this dependence, and it's been on the list of policy priorities going back through the early Putin years and through the years of the presidency of Medvedev. And I think for all of the various clever efforts that have been put forward, that Russia would be expert in nanotechnology or new other technological revolutions, I sense that the amount of effort that's being put into this from inside Moscow is dwindling quickly, essentially giving up on the idea, at least in their lifetimes, that they would likely make any progress.
All right, please.
My name is Maria Exner. I'm deputy editor of the online section of Die Zeit in Germany. Thank you very much for the insightful comments. And my question would be about Russia today, which hasn't been mentioned as yet. And I think if we think about the relationship between Russia and the general public in Europe, I would be very interested about your views on how important Russia today is for influencing the public opinion
in Europe. So
in Europe,
Angela is responsible.
and if we as German and also other European civil society actors do pay not enough or too much attention on the media influencing that's triggered by the Kremlin.
Okay.
Well, I will start with this. So I can actually tell you more about the United States. A few months ago, I was on one of these early morning television cable call-in shows, which I haven't done since then because of what happened during this broadcast. Anyway, so people from all parts of the United States can call in and ask questions. And I was amazed that I had people calling in who sounded genuine, you know, from the states like Georgia and Kansas and all these things, saying, we don't believe the New York Times and CNN. We watch RT every day, and we think those are the real truths. Now, again, this is an unscientific sample. I can tell you that in my local Washington area, the local Korean grocery has RT on. I have no idea how much it influences people. I do know that at this Valdai conference, we had the head of RT, Margarita Simonyan, speak with President Putin, ask him a question, and talk about how they were being you know, there's some discussion in the United States about whether they should be branded a foreign agent or not, which doesn't mean that they couldn't broadcast. It would just mean that they're branded as that. So I think one shouldn't exaggerate it, but I do think in the US, among Trump supporters, RT apparently is something that people watch and maybe believe. It was the first time I'd ever heard the story about Hillary Clinton, quote unquote, selling our uranium to Russia, which, as you may now, has become, has now become a big topic here. But I know less about the data in Europe and how influential it is.
There is an author, Hannes Adamait, and he wrote absolutely fantastic 2 essays about the influence of RT and Sputnik in Germany, evolution of the German public opinion. So Google him and maybe.
That's Hannes, A-D-O-M-E-I-T.
A-D-O-M-E-I-T.
Used to teach at Fletcher School.
He did.
All right, very good, thank you. Please.
Hello, I'm Mikhail, a visiting researcher at the Davis
Very
Center.
active, Mikhail, very active.
I have a question to Professor Stent. You mentioned that the outskirts of the European Union, particularly you said Hungary, are becoming increasingly pro-Moscow. So they seem to be resisting the structures they're part of. How does this make them pro-Moscow?
I mean, pro-Moscow in terms of signing, well, first of all, being against the sanctions, right? I mean, Orban has spoken out against the sanctions. You know, he's had various visits with President Putin at a time when other EU countries weren't doing that, you know, certainly in the wake of Ukraine. I believe signing, you know, Russia's going to build another nuclear power plant in Hungary, trade, and just in some of the things that Orban says, which have, you know, have been uncritical. So in comparison to some of the other, the mainstream of the European Union countries, it's different. That's what I meant. I don't know if is it pro-Moscow or not, but it's certainly not within, you know, what is supposed to be the mainstream of EU kind of solidarity on the sanctions regime and other things. But as I said, I mean, Hungary can't break that. I mean, you know, the sanctions regime will last as long as the Germans and the French and the British want it to.
That's true. That's true. Okay, very good, please.
Hi there, my name is Isabel Finkel and I'm a journalist in Turkey. I hope my question won't seem too self-indulgent because it is about that country and how it fits into the tensions with Europe that we've been discussing. Obviously, over the course of the period under discussion, Russia's attitude to Turkey seems, you know, from Turkey's perspective at least, to have changed drastically if you compare their attitude after the shooting down of the jet in November 2015 to the way that the assassination of the Russian ambassador to Turkey was sort of swept onto the carpet in December 2016, to the more recent lifting of these formerly sort of intractable sanctions on Turkish tomatoes. I'd like to ask anyone on the panel what Russia's intentions are there and what it's trying to do with its leverage over Turkey, how you see that.
So would you like to take that?
Yeah,
Sure.
Turkey is yours.
Yeah.
I like Turkey very much, so I will own it then. So thank you for your question. And I was in Istanbul on the day that the plane was shot down, doing a Harvard Business School case study on Turkish-Russian relations. So it was a quite exciting moment in the history of the relations between those two countries, and it changed the course of my interview questions over the rest of those couple of days. What I would say about the depth of those relations, which are not just natural gas. So Blue Stream, of course, goes back some decades. The proposed nuclear power plants and various elements of that nuclear deal, I think those are one element of the Russian-Turkish relationship that continues to be very robust. And Russia needs Turkey. Turkey pays good prices. It hasn't renegotiated the oil indexation of the gas contracts, which the European firms have done. So it's a very, very profitable market. I think there's a deeper need for Turkish-Russian rapprochement that I think helps to explain the ambassador's non-issue. And that is the role of Turkish Stream in the vision of Gazprom for the pattern of gas flows to Europe, but not just to Europe. So when South Stream was abandoned and replaced more or less with Turkish Stream, with the idea that this pipeline would take Russian gas to Turkey, but to a part of Turkey that's not very heavily populated, would make its way into the Turkish infrastructure, back toward the parts of Turkey that are heavily populated, but as close as you can get to Europe without actually building a pipe to Europe, as a kind of political statement to European firms and to the Commission and to Europe as a whole, that if Europe wants Russia to invest in infrastructure, with European firms' involvement as well, to bring Russian gas directly to Europe, it's going to have to create a set of real incentives for it to do so. Incentives that exist in the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, but incentives that ceased to exist in the South Stream pipeline, with the idea that we would build a pipe, they would build a pipe that's big enough to serve the Turkish market, and possibly the European market as well. But if the Europeans want that gas, then they will have to build their own dam pipe to Turkey to collect it, and the Russians will bring it as far as Turkey and no further. And insofar as both of these elements of the relationship, the nuclear deals and the Turkish Stream pipeline, are essential for Gazprom's vision of its overall connection to Europe, to me that suggests the ways in which this rapprochement has proceeded and the relations have healed after what was a very, very difficult couple of days and weeks after the shooting down of the plane.
Tim? Sure. Let me just add something on the political side here. And that is, we were talking about illiberal democracies this morning in Turkey. President Putin and President Erdogan certainly see eye to eye on a number of these issues. Turkey is a member of NATO, but has a very complicated and somewhat contentious relationship with the United States. It's now just for the first time agreed to buy advanced Russian weaponry. This is really a first in terms of a major NATO ally. It's changed its stance on Syria. I mean, Russia has succeeded in becoming the go-to power in Syria. That's a subject for another discussion. But Turkey and Russia were on opposite sides there now, and the Turks appear to have accepted now that at least for some time, President Assad will remain in power and have, in a sense, gotten with the Russian program. Russia, immediately after the attempted coup, supported President Erdogan. There's been no criticism, obviously, from Russia about what he's doing domestically. So I think there's I mean, the economic side is very important, but it fits right in with the changing geopolitics, too.
But on Ukraine and on Kurds, we are strongly in a different camp.
Different, yeah. True.
And Erdogan supports, by the way, Crimean Tatars. Well, that's why we are not going to buy his Turkish tomatoes.
All right, so our time has elapsed. I know there's a question, but you can perhaps just ask the question afterwards. Jagash, are you going to somehow close the, so we're not going to have a ceremony or anything at the end. So this is the last. This is the last panel of your day, right? Well, I think we should all. Well, I think we should all really thank CES, Jagash personally, and CES and his crew for organizing this and for including Russia in it, because Russia is, of course, part of the phenomenon. And I think this has been a very informative panel, and I'm happy to have been part of it. So let's thank our panelists. No, you'll have to ask the question probably later. Sorry, that's what I meant to say.
Again.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
No, потом.
Okay.
It's okay. Okay. All right.
Hey, good to see you.